a lot of the things that we heard this week wouldn't have been possible without the pioneering work of men like the one sitting next to me. And it is a very great privilege to welcome Mr. Tom Oberheim.
And I'm glad to be here. It's been an education for me already, which we'll maybe talk about later.
Yeah, but before we go into that, because there's an awful lot of history to cover, and we're not even starting talking physics yet, but yeah, there's like a lot of things and a lot of information that we already had to process this week, and there will be more coming. So we figured this might be a good chance to probably have 2 or 3 minutes to let it all sink in and get ourselves ready for this one. Are you ready? The audio is not ready. Yeah, yeah. I wish I had anything to do with this, but yeah, you might want to ask yourself, hang on, we came here to talk about synthesis. Why the heck is he playing us some hippie, psychedelic, folky nonsense there? And well, you might actually have the explanation, because you know 2 of the people. That song was, by the way, called Love Song for the Dead Che Guevara, and it's by a band called the United States of America.
Oh, God, yes.
And
I forgot all about that.
and I believe there's 2 people in there that you kind of know pretty well, yes. Like a certain Joseph Bird and a Dorothy. You want to tell us a little bit about them?
Now, first of all, this is not an Oberheim record. This is a band started by a guy I met at UCLA. Oh, I'm sorry. This is not an Oberheim. There's no Oberheim on this record, because when this record was made, there was no Oberheim synthesizers. This is 1966. And I was a student at UCLA, which is a big university in Los Angeles, and even though I studied physics, I was in the music department all the time. I would take a class in physics and go back to the music department. And there I met this guy named Joseph Bird, who did some incredible experimental music at UCLA in the mid-60s. It wasn't classical music, it was actually more happenings than music. And then later and I got to know him pretty well, and he had a girlfriend named Dorothy, and after I finished my degree, I went off to do computer engineering, and he started this band called United States of America. They lasted about less than 1 year, made 2 records, and the band wasn't so interesting, but the people were very interesting. So that's kind of the story. Oh, but the most important part of that story is the band the original people broke up because they always fought. You know, I'm sure your bands, you never fight with your other people. Everybody's very happy. But in those days, these people fought, and they broke up the band. And the singer started the band again with different people. And in the original band, there was a device called a ring modulator that was designed by some guy I never met. And when the band broke up, he took his ring modulator and went. And she started the band over and came to me. She knew I was an engineer, and she said, build us a ring modulator. And that is the beginning of Oberheim, when I built her a ring modulator. And that led to, from there.
And I believe that is probably one of the main reasons why the sound from album 1 to 2 kind of changes so dramatically into this ethereal.
A lot different.
Yeah. Now, when you say, I mean, obviously we take a lot of things for granted these days, but when you said, oh yeah, ring modulator, no problem, I got my physics degree, but how did you actually find out how to build it?
Well, this gal, Dorothy, came to me and said, Tom, you need to build us a ring modulator. I had no idea what it was. But by then I'd been a computer engineer for 6-7 years. And so I went to the UCLA Engineering Library, and I spent several hours looking through the books, and I found in some engineering books, they had this circuit, and I looked at it, and I couldn't understand how this circuit could be anything interesting in music. But I kept looking, and finally I found an article from a magazine in 1960 where a gentleman, a famous engineer, originally from Germany but moved to the United States in the 30s and designed organs and whatever, he started designing some stuff for doing electronic music even before Moog did. And he designed a modular, wasn't a synthesizer, but a modular electronic music system. And in there he had, one thing was a ring modulator, and then I explained how you could do a ring modulator and use it in music. And so I took that and then started making my own ring modulators.
This Harold Bode you're talking about,
Yes.
I believe it's actually the same article that inspired Bob Moog as well.
Well, they were good friends, yeah. I mean, of course, Mr. Bode was an older guy, and in those days, Bob Moog was, this was the early 1960s, he was just in college, he was just beginning. So I think in some way Bode was a mentor for Bob. And the idea of taking circuits and making modules that you could hook together with patch cords, which is what, of course, the first Moog synthesizer was that came from, that was the basic idea of doing that was Bode, but Moog added on to that idea to where he brought in oscillators, filters, envelope generators, to where that was the birth of the analog synthesizers we know it. So it was a combination of these two guys working.
Well, at the same time, you probably, like many of us when we grew up, didn't know much about these things. And also, you were born in a different Manhattan, not the Big Apple kind of thing, but just slightly the opposite of it.
Yeah, I was born in a small town in the very center of the United States, in a state called Kansas, where growing up I even started building, I could say I built stereos for my friends, but this was before stereo was invented, so I was building hi-fis for friends, and so I started electronics in junior high school and built a lot of amplifiers for people, and then later on I did more of the same when I actually started doing this for musician friends that I met at UCLA.
Now, radios have this absolute intricate fascination for little kids, and you know, I mean, at least FM radios used to have, you could turn that dial and you get all these weird frequencies, and somewhere the line splits, like the ones that are looking for the new station and the ones that take the screwdriver out and take it apart.
Well, I know what you're talking about, and I think you're seeing that from the point of view of more today, where people are more ready to experiment with electronics, or just any sound, whether it's electronic or not. But I think in the 60s, it was a little more conventional, and there wasn't the facility to present experimental music like there is today. So I think, you know, this is a long time ago. This is 50 years ago, and so you went to music school. First you learned Bach, and then you learned Beethoven, and it took special, interesting people to break out of that and do experimental stuff. So it started slow. You know, not everybody that heard a strange sound out of their FM was ready to make music with it. It took much time for this to develop, I think.
But just taking that step back, let's say you're 11 years old or whatever, and you're literally taking your mom's radio apart.
I didn't experiment with the sound of radios. What I was doing was, when I was growing up, it was big band jazz, and seeing who, I listened to Stan Kenton and these bands like that, and my friends and I would get together and we'd do things like play records from different bands and see which trumpet player could play the highest note or something like that. It was much later when I started to experiment with electronics to actually make music. Really, I wasn't the pioneer that Moog was. I was kind of the second generation. So it took me a while to break through being sort of a conventional, interest in conventional music to where I was interested in more interesting things. And we'll get to that when we talk about the ARP thing.
Speaking of interesting things, there's a rumor that you, like many other greats from some of this room to Merle Haggard, shared a deep love for trains as well.
Yeah, I used to, a friend of mine in high school, we'd do whatever we did, study or something in the evening. At 11 o'clock at night, we'd go down to the train station in this little town and wait for this train to go by that was going from Chicago to Los Angeles, and dreaming of going to the big city, which of course I did many years later. So whether it was a very cold winter day or winter night or whatever, we were down there watching the train go by. So.
Okay, there's this dream of the big city, but nevertheless, I mean, Kansas State is a relatively renowned university, and why did you?
It wasn't a great university when I was there. It was later became better, but in those days I wasn't yet interested in music as much. I got into music late. I mean, I had to learn. I'm sure most of you have got enough music training to know what a fugue is. It's a certain kind of counterpoint that if you're a music student, you learn to play on the piano or whatever. I learned about the word fugue off of a Dave Brubeck jazz album because I didn't know anything about music until I was in high school. I didn't study music till later. So I kind of came in a different way, that, you know, not the normal piano lessons, music, you know, none of that. It came totally different. But of course, I was listening to records from the day that when they were still 78s, and to where I drove my parents crazy. I had one record I had in the 9th grade that was by a band called the Sauter-Finnegan Orchestra. It was only existed in the early 50s and had this one song, and I played that one song over and over and over for hours to where my parents were almost nuts. And maybe that's a little like what would happen later.
One or two people might know that feeling, yes. So what was the initial point for you leaving Kansas behind and going west?
As I said, I'd listened to a lot of jazz when I was in high school, and I went away from my hometown to Manhattan to go to a big city to make some money so I could go back to college and not have to work after school every day. And I met some people that were older than me, and also in those days I read a magazine that's in the United States still in existence, mainly about jazz, called Downbeat. And in the back of the magazine there were little ads for different things, and then one ad was for a jazz club in a part of Los Angeles, and basically the ad said you can come to this jazz club and you can come in for free. Now what they didn't tell you is you had to buy 2 drinks. But I thought, wow, you can go and hear these great jazz musicians and you don't have to pay. So I was ready to go to California when one day one of them said, Tom, we're going to California. I said, great, I want to come. And so I went to California. And I never regretted it. It was a good move.
So what way I mean, LA is not exactly the smallest village on earth where you just go to the central square and go like, okay, I maneuver around. You kind of need to have some anchor points there to navigate.
Well, when I arrived in Los Angeles, I think I arrived in Los Angeles July of 1956. I had $10 in my pocket, and I had no job, and my parents had no money. They were back in Kansas, so I was totally on my own. So I had to live very, very cheaply. And in those days, petrol cost, I don't know, €0.25 per gallon. It was incredibly cheap. So I couldn't afford to go to good restaurants or go to other entertainment. So I just would fill up my car, my old broken down car, barely ran, and I just drove all over Los Angeles learning what it was, what the city was. And I could have become a taxi driver. I knew the city very well.
So, what other profession did you choose outside of being?
Well, when I got to Los Angeles, at first I worked at an aircraft company just because it was the first job I could find. One moment. And that job was pretty boring, but in December of 1956, I was just 20 years old. I saw an ad in the newspaper for a draftsman trainee job, and I don't know if you know what a draftsman is. It's drawing engineering drawings, and it was at a company called National Cash Register, which was a big company in America. So I went to apply for this job. I'll be okay in a minute. And it turned out that this company was a very early company in the computer business. This was, like I say, in December of 1956. I had never heard, I didn't know what a computer was. So I got there, and I was just a very lowly guy. I didn't have a degree in a college degree yet. I really was just out of high school. But they gave me the job because I had a little drafting. And when I got to this company, it was just like, I don't know, maybe it's the first time some of you saw a mixer or saw a synthesizer or heard music you like. It's just like it was instantaneous love for something, and that was the computer idea and the computer technology. And in those days, of course, the computer went from here to that wall, just one computer. And it was like, this is it. This is what I want to do. And so even though I'd moved to Los Angeles without any idea of ever going back to university, I was just 20 years old and having a great time in the big city. Once I worked at this company and saw these engineers building these incredible things called computers, I just had to do that. So I knew I had to go back to college. And so I went, and the company let me work part-time, and I started at UCLA. But on this point in time, I had no plans to do anything but just be a computer engineer for the rest of my life and work for some big company.
I mean, you had quite a few jobs at various kind of well-known companies these days.
You mean
not your own. I mean,
yeah,
at that time,
from 1959 to 1969, I worked at 6 or 7 different computer companies. I was the kind of guy who, if I didn't like the job, I just left. And so some places I worked a year. There was one computer company I worked at for 3 weeks, and I didn't like the boss, so I left. But in those 10 years, I had 7 jobs. And in that age, when you had a resume and it showed you had many jobs, everybody said, oh, there's something wrong with you. You're not a good worker because you always leave. I said, I don't care. I was having fun. So if the job wasn't good, I left. I think it's more common that people do that now, but it wasn't then.
Now, within those jobs, they took you to Hughes, which is a major military provider, Lockheed, NASA. And what is it that people these days sometimes seem to underestimate the connection between sound synthesis and the military-industrial complex on the other hand?
Well, what a lot of people, I think, in this world don't understand, I'm sure all of you understand, but a lot of people don't understand, is the essence of art. And I don't mean just music, or I mean everything: music, painting, poetry, happenings, whatever. And there's exceptions. Maybe Red Bull is an exception, but the typical company is not interested in the artistic side of our world. They're interested in making money. And so there really isn't it's a rare connection that you have something going on interesting artistically and this, as you say, the military-industrial complex. The only time that really happens is a company is so successful that they can throw a little money at art. But it's not common. I don't know about in Europe, but certainly in the U.S. you can read, oh yes, IBM sponsored something at a museum, but of course it's a tiny fraction of their total income that they contribute to art. So art is kind of one of the stepchilds of our society. It's a struggle usually for most people, I think.
So if we consider ourselves as those stepchilds, can you probably tell us one or two things that we kind of borrowed from the military world technologically to create art?
When I first got involved in electronic music, well, of course, I mentioned the first thing was the ring modulator, and then later I did another pedal. But my first real involvement, if kind of maybe jumping ahead a little, was when I started selling Arp synthesizers. I was the first Arp synthesizer dealer on the West Coast. It was just me. And the thing that characterized Arp is the Arp synthesizer, although it maybe didn't have as rich a sound as the Moog, it was designed by an engineer who, his name was Alan Perlman. That's where the name Alan R. Perlman was ARP. And he had, for 10 years before that, worked in designing circuits for the military. And it just turns out there's certain circuits that you need to design for industrial and military purposes that actually also are useful for synthesizers. Probably the most important is he knew how to design an oscillator that didn't drift. We all love the Mini Moog, but it did have a reputation for having a drift problem. I think as years went along, they found solutions to that. But where this guy, Perlman, he, from his experience designing circuits for the industry and whatever, he knew a way to design oscillators that didn't drift. So there is that connection.
Now, an oscillator is one of the key elements in that ring modulator, but can we get a little pedestrian explanation for what these things actually are and what they do?
What ring modulators are.
Yeah.
Yeah, a ring modulator is a really very simple device that makes very complex sounds. I'm sure most of you or all of you have had experience with music enough to appreciate that what we would call the harmonic aspect of music is based on an overtone series that is we naturally I think human beings are naturally attuned to. Of course, in other words, to make it simple, octaves are a frequency ratio of 2 to 1. A major fifth is a ratio of close to 3 to 2, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this thing that as human beings, I mean, it exists not only in Western music, but in African tribe music, this idea of fifths and octaves and fourths. It's just universal. It's just something in the human being. And that's based on frequencies that are related by ratios. What the ring modulator does is it totally destroys that thing that we're used to, or that our ears are attuned to, and it changes the frequencies by absolute amounts of frequency. Well, let me give you an example. If you put 300 hertz tone into one side of a ring modulator and 200 hertz tone into the other side of a ring modulator, what you get out is 100 hertz, which is 300 minus 200, and 500 hertz, which is 300 plus 200. And these are totally non-harmonic. Our mind doesn't find them as nice, pleasant sounds, and yet, is it always to be pleasant? And so the ring modulator destroys the harmonic things we're used to, but in the hands of a great musician. And then, unfortunately, I didn't bring any ring modulator in the early days of selling ring modulators to musicians. Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea and many people like this made really great stuff with this crazy sound that you get from a ring modulator. But it adds and subtracts frequencies rather than multiplies them by ratios, is what happens.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we all got that. In a short note. But probably, even if you don't fully understand it, you said you feel these kind of things. And the same as like in most arts, there's always these aesthetic of relationships, of like the same way as in design or whatever. And I believe you met another person at UCLA that was challenging that from a different side, and like this guy Don Ellis, who some people might know from different contexts.
Who was that?
Don
Oh,
Ellis.
yeah. One of the musicians I met at UCLA was a jazz trumpet player named Don Ellis, who later went on to start a very innovative big band, jazz big band, and he became famous because most of what he did with his jazz band, the songs that he arranged and wrote for the band and other people wrote were typically not in either 4/4 time or 3/4 time. They were in 7/4 and 11/4 and 19/8 and whatever. I got to know Don very well because he was one of these people that I built equipment for before I started Oberheim. So he had a ring modulator. He had, on his trumpet, he had all kinds of octave dividers and whatever. And he did some really interesting experimental music in the 60s. And working for him was also an instrumental part of me getting into the music thing, because it was through the scout at the United States of America and Don Ellis and some other people that I saw in kind of a subtle way, saw a future for me, because after 10 years I was kind of tired of designing computer stuff, and I was ready for something else. And so this also led me into where I went with electronic music instruments.
Which brings us to this little thing. Which brings,
Oops, hit the wrong button.
That's the one we
This
want.
is the picture of my first commercial product, which is called a Maestro ring modulator. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a picture. I forgot to bring a picture of, well, actually, this is electronically, and the box is the same as my first product, but the graphics on my first product were much different from this. But the company that I sold this through didn't like that. It was a little too adventurous. And so they had this look, and I wish I had the picture of the other, because it's just, from first product, it was just a great thing. I looked today and I couldn't find it. But go to the letterhead. Now this is I think when I started the Oberheim company in 1969, I did it in the traditional way. I went to a company that designed me a logo, and but the guy that designed this was that designed the logo, and this is the letterhead. This is what I'd use to write letters on, although I really never wrote very many letters. But the guy that designed this Oberheim logo was a guy who was very big in the Los Angeles advertising art scene in the days, this was 1969, when comic art was very popular in advertising. I don't know, many years ago in the Rolling Stone magazine, there was always a column by a guy named Robert Crumb, and his signature was the main character in this comic strip. His foot would always be out, and the foot would be very big, and it was called the trucking note, or the trucking. He was trucking. Have you ever heard this term before? So this is called the trucking note, and it's one of the all-time great logos. Unfortunately, I no longer own it, but we'll get to that story later.
Yeah.
So, the point was that the ring modulator the original ring modulator had this logo about this big on the front of the ring modulator with beautiful exploding graphic. The name Oberheim was in this exploding typeface. It was just beautiful. But they didn't like that. They wanted the more conventional black and silver.
Well, I guess it's pretty mind-blowing just to see that even on little side notes like the logo, you get to people that most of us would rather know through movies like that American Splendor thing, and just in a really roundabout way. And it just seemed like a lot of things were just happening in a really small entity, despite it being a really big city.
Well, the influence here was, by the time I started Oberheim, I really was sick of designing computers. I'd done it 10 years, very concentrated. I just wanted out. And I got involved with just the guy that designed this and a little ad agency that helped me do this. They were into far out music, and so it was not going to the big advertising agency and spending a lot of money. It was just kind of like friends doing stuff, and it was a very creative time, and we were doing it for fun. I had no idea if I'd ever have a successful company. I mean, it was just me when I started, just me in my bedroom.
But just about before you started, I mean, you worked quite a decent job with 14 hours a day, and
you mean
before you went into your own business?
Oh, I don't know if I always worked that much, but I worked at these 7 computer type companies, and I enjoyed it while I did it, because computer design is an interesting profession that very few people do now, because it's all done for you in a little chip. And when I did it, you had to build it out of individual little parts. But I was pretty much tired of that and wanted to. And by then I'd had several years' experience working with experimental musicians, and it was very exciting to be part of that. I wasn't a performing musician myself, really, not an instrumental musician, so I got my joy in doing stuff for my musician friends, and that carried me all through. We'll talk about that more later. That's always been my driving force, is that I make something and then a musician takes it and creates something else from it. And so I was ready to leave the computer thing and do this, even if it was very small and didn't make any money. I was happy.
Well, your musician friends are one side of the game, but if you do want to go into business and you want to start something, then the places where you go and look for investment, you might start at your neighbors.
Well,
the bank.
I got some. I just went around and got money from a few friends, and enough to get started. I think the total investment was $5,000 or $6,000. I thought that was a lot of money then. It's not much to start a company on, but I had no business plan, no plan how I'd be able to pay them back or anything. So it wasn't a lot of money.
Rumor has it that 1,000 of those 5 or 6 were coming from a neighbor of yours.
Oh, yes, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Well, I don't know if this idea of whether this is something that has any meaning, but my first investor was a guy that worked for a company that did secret work for the United States government. They studied things like, they did war games, and they would say, what would happen if the Russia or Soviet Union attacked the United States, and how many bombers would they need to respond, this kind of crazy stuff. And in 1970, the political world in the United States was turned upside down when a friend of this, a neighbor of mine, went public with what in the United States at the time were called the Pentagon Papers. And this was basically told the story. It was a Defense Department United States study that showed that the conduct of the war in Vietnam was a disaster. And everybody thought we were going to win that war. And this document, which came from inside the United States Defense Department, said that no, there's no way we can win this war. So this one guy made it public, and my neighbor was his friend and helped him with it. And I think the point of this is, what's the point? Well, the company that helped me get my logo design and get this letterhead design was also the company on which these Pentagon Papers were copied on, the same Xerox machine. And so it's of course, it's a 35-year-old story, but it's interesting to some of us, some people remember this horrible time when we had this crazy war. It sounds like today, America having a crazy war. Where have we heard that before?
Yeah, one starts to wonder, like, you gave him his money back, right? Was that before or after he was in the court case?
Well, he came to me about a year after he invested and said, Tom, I need my investment back. And I said, fine. So I gave him his $1,000 back. And that's the last time I ever saw him. The next time that I heard anything about this, somebody knocked on my door and said, Mr. Oberheim, I'm so-and-so from the FBI. Have you seen Mr. Russo? This guy's name was Tony Russo. And I said, no, I haven't seen him in many months, and I didn't know why. And later I found out, of course, that the United States government was coming down on the guy that made public the papers, and this friend, my original investor, who was his helper. And so I had the FBI knocking at my door.
Well, these days you can sell a lot of records with that. But, now, back to this little thing. That got you quite a few calls from other people as well, especially Los Angeles being the film capital.
Right. Probably one of the things that got me going after I decided to start the business was before I designed this particular ring modulator, which was specifically for the performing musician, I designed some ring modulators that were earlier versions as I was learning how to make them. And the word got around in the music community in Los Angeles that I had this thing called a ring modulator, and I got a phone call from a movie composer who said, I'm doing a movie and I want to use the ring modulator on the movie soundtrack. So it was a soundtrack for the movie called Beneath the Planet of the Apes. And so I took my ring modulator to the movie studio, and they used it on the soundtrack. And during the break, several of the people in the movie orchestra came up and said, ooh, what's this? Can I buy one? So that was really the start of the business.
So this was really like what we see every night here in the city, like Cerveza Beer, something like you go and approach someone like an original merchant.
I don't quite.
Like it's really like a face-to-face business at this
Well,
stage.
it was, yes. It was. All I was doing was making a few of these for local musicians in Los Angeles. But then when I decided to go from just making one ring modulator at a time, I think in the beginning they were kind of rack mount type things, I decided to do this. It was a time in music when in jazz, pretty much in jazz only, I think the history books say it basically started with and Miles Davis doing this in the late 60s on, I forget which album, but he insisted that Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett, of course, two famous keyboard players, play for him, but he didn't want them to play acoustic piano. He wanted to play the Fender Rhodes piano. So it turned out that this was a sound that just the jazz keyboard players and other keyboard players, just when they discovered this Rhodes piano, it became very popular. But at the same time, electronic music was starting to be heard. There were some synthesizer records, but it was not possible in this time, this is 69 and 70, to take a synthesizer on the road unless, of course, you're Keith Emerson and you've got roadies and a big truck. There was no small synthesizer yet. And so I started selling a lot of the ring modulators to people who would use them on their Fender Rhodes pianos. And There are records out, I just didn't happen to find them for today, that show either Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea playing solos where they're playing the Fender Rhodes through a ring modulator.
Did that within the jazz community cause a similar reaction to Bob Dylan playing the electrified guitar at Newport?
Well, I think that that was more a reaction of the crowd to Dylan playing electric guitar. It was a little different in that I don't think that, well, I know for sure Keith Jarrett didn't want to play electronics. He's always said in interviews he hates electronics. But I think that the jazz musicians who did this kind of experimental work with ring modulators, they immediately made it a musical thing, and it was more accepted. I think in the case of the Dylan example, it wasn't so much a musical rejection. It's just, you know, our hero is playing electric. How can this be?
A big part of your business at the time was from another entity, like of a similar size. Could you explain to us what a phase shifter is and does?
Still in the 1960s, one of the things I did was I met some musicians, not at UCLA, but through some friends who were doing what later in the 70s I suppose would be called folk rock. I don't know what it was called when I first met them, but it was the kind of stuff that led to the Eagles and whatever. And these people didn't need electronic music devices because they were doing traditional music, but I did do some recording and built up some sound amplification equipment and whatever. What was the question?
Phase shifter.
Oh yeah, phase shifter. The musicians, this group of musicians that I started doing work for, were still in high school when I first met them, and they were trying everything. And one of the things that they had discovered or listened to was George Harrison playing guitar through a Leslie speaker, and I don't remember which Beatles song that was on, but I recently read about it in a really great book by one of the engineers that did a lot of Beatles recording, my friends were so interested in this sound of what happens when you put an electric guitar, instead of playing through a guitar amp, you play it through a Leslie rotating organ speaker. And I thought, well, that's a great sound, and so I was looking for another product, so I started experimenting with electronics, and to make a long story short, I eventually found a circuit called a phase shifter circuit that simulated the sound of the swishy sound you get from a Leslie speaker. And at the time, as I mentioned, I was selling these ring modulators through a big company that was a marketing company, so I took the phase shifter to them, and they were interested, and over the next 3 or 4 years, I sold about 100,000 phase shifters, because it was the first, this is before MXR or any of the other companies, so that was the first phase shifter that was on the market. And that really put me in business to where I now had enough money to do more things.
Do the fun stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that's quite a transition, going from like soldering together a few circuits for your friends to like, how many units you said? 6 digit
over
figures?
3 or 4 years, about 100,000.
Oh.
And most of that time was, my company was just 3 people. Now that was, took 4 years to do it, but it was just 3 or 4 people, so it was really kind of exciting. I went from, as we say in America, beans and rice, meaning very little money to buy much, to where I was starting to actually make some money with my company. It was an exciting time.
But at the same time, we're talking handmade, like everything done in your workshop, like
oh yeah,
no offshore production.
I had a place, so in those days, Oberheim was about 1/4 the size of this room. It was just myself and 2 or 3 other people, but some days we'd make 50 phase shifters, and it was a good time.
How long can you work on creating something, recreating something like that again and again. I mean, sounds like conveyor belt work.
If all you did was make them and ship them out the door, then it would be very boring work. But when you do that, and at the same time you get a phone call from someone like Herbie Hancock or Jan Hammer, and they say, Tom, we love your phase shifter. Well, I could work 24 hours and do it. If it's, and that's the way it's been for me for all the years I made electronic music stuff. It's not just make it, sell it, make some money. It's, as we'll hear later, it'll play some music that has Oberheim on it. It's like, even today, it's still a thrill to build something, because the process is, for me, has always been, I use my engineering knowledge and my love of music, and I take the first step, and that's to build the instrument, but the process is not finished. The process is, that's only the start of the process. The process is ended when that machine, whatever it is, ends up in the hands of the musician, and then they make it into, they complete the process. And so I'm part, even with something as simple as a phase shifter, I was just part of the process, and this feedback of great musicians coming to me and say, oh, Tom, I love this, I love the ring modulator, I love the phase shifter, and of course later other things. It wasn't like just turning a crank, it was a thrilling thing, and if I do it again, it'll still be fun.
So it feels a bit like unleashing a sonic nuke or something. You just like...
Well, it's like, why do we... I would guess that most people in this room are not looking forward to being a great lawyer, a great business manager, and having a big company. You're here because you make music, and there's something about making music that it's hard to explain to people that don't. And so in my case, I don't make the music itself, but I'm part of the process. And in my case, the process has been very fulfilling and exciting, because I don't play the music, but I make the instrument, and then I either go to hear the musicians play, or I have the of course it started LPs and then CDs. And let's face it, that world of being creative is, not everybody in the world's creative. I suppose that's maybe a good thing, or we're just different. We're different than most other people, I think. We're just different. Otherwise, you get a job and go into the insurance company, and or the bank or whatever, and you're the important thing to you is to climb up the ladder of success, and that's not what's important, at least not for me. I mean, of course, we'd all like to, in my case, I had a hit synthesizer, and you'd like to have a hit record, I'm sure, but still, the process is just different for us. We were driven by a different power, I think.
Now, when you deal with that different power on a day-to-day basis, and then all of a sudden you got to face reality, and you enter your first NAMM show. Or NAMM rather than NAMM in that time.
Yeah, Well, although when I look back now, 30 years later, it seems like it happened rather quickly, but for me, after I got the ring modulator and the phase shifter, I was able to start going to some trade shows, and it was that, again, that's part of the process of building up, but it didn't happen overnight. Nothing, but rarely does it happen fast. You have to do the work, and it means designing and selling and going to trade shows and meeting musicians and doing all of this. Is that what you were?
Well, I mean, I just try to imagine what it would be like if I had an Arp 2600 in the first place. But no, if I also had to sell it to someone at a trade show and what it would like then, because I imagine it's slightly different than Anaheim or the Frankfurt Music Fair.
Well, when I did work for, when I was, well, briefly the story is, I did the ring modulator, then the phase shifter, then I was looking for a way to make a little more money to keep my company going, so I started becoming an ARP dealer. That's what I think you're referring to. I didn't show ARPs at trade shows, though. I sold them in Los Angeles to different musicians, studio musicians, movie, as well as a lot of jazz people. And I was starting to sell it to rock musicians then in the early 70s. I'm not sure that's the answer to
There's something interesting in there, which is, on the one hand, you go to these shows, and it would obviously still be interesting to see like what the atmosphere was there. But there you're representing something that you built with your very own hands.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Whereas in the other thing, you got something pretty alright, but that probably lets you benefit on different levels.
Well, when I first started going to the trade show, like the NAMM show, it was to see what people were doing. And I wasn't yet, because the first Oberheim products were basically sold by a big company in Chicago, so I didn't have to do the selling. But I'd go to trade shows and see, what other people were doing in different pedals and synthesizers, and starting to get ideas. I'm not quite sure that's where you're going.
Was that the only way to find out about these things?
You mean, you mean synthesizers? The synthesizer was being accepted in movie music starting in the late 60s, and there was a pioneer guy in Los Angeles who was a synthesizer expert. He wasn't a designer, he was a user, and I got to know him real well, so I got I had my introduction to synthesizers in, let's say, 70, 71, and I remember talking to him about the synthesizer work he did on Beach Boys and some of the other things. He was also, not only did he have synthesizers, but he knew theremins and all of this. And so if some of you know Good Vibrations, there's a point where there's this, he was the guy that did that on Good Vibrations with a theremin. But there was a group of people in Los Angeles, and he was kind of in the middle of it, where people were starting to use synthesize and do other electronic music things, and it was starting to grow. And I was sort of part of that, not a big contributor yet, but I was seeing that it was growing and developing. He was a guy that had this idea, if you've ever been to see a movie where it says the sound is by THX, I think is the company, where it has this big chord where it's kind of a inharmonic chord, and then it all comes together in a very fat harmonic chord. Well, that's kind of a poor digital copy of what this guy did with two large Moog synthesizers. It just makes your hair stand on end when you hear the really good one that he did on a record that he did with a friend in the early 70s. I should have brought that, because just that sound alone is great. His name was Paul Beaver, and he was really a pioneer, and I learned a lot from him. That's where I think the spark for wanting to be involved in synthesizers began. He showed me some things, and so all of a sudden, what is this thing? It's really interesting.
Could you probably help us a little bit, as in, I mean, if you recall that moment when you were standing in front of a 2600, and if you, no matter whether you look at a plugin or any sort of classic analog piece, there's all these buttons and faders and stuff, and you just want to create a sound that's not been used before, and are there some general techniques of like how to find your way or maneuver around the surface of such a thing? Maybe.
In the days when Oberheim was years later, when Oberheim was starting to build synthesizers, a young engineer came to me and said, "Tom, I want to work for your company. I really want to build synthesizers." I said, "Oh, okay. Well, then explain to me the basic analog synthesizer patch, the basic patch. We call it the basic patch." And he said, I don't know, what do you mean, the basic, what is this basic patch? I don't know that. So I said, well, okay, goodbye. But now I could get real philosophical and talk about how this relates to physics and whatever.
Can
but
we
it's really
that for like in the Cliff Notes version?
Yeah, we can do the Cliff Notes. It's very, if you take an Arp 2600 or a mini Moog or a large Moog or any analog synth, the place where you start and where you do 90% of your work is very simple. It's two oscillators and you can choose the different waveforms. It's two oscillators that may or may not track a keyboard, depending on how adventurous you are. And those two oscillators go through a simple two-input mixer into a voltage-controlled filter, and then the voltage-controlled filter goes to the voltage-controlled amplifier, and you have an envelope generator to modulate the filter, and you have an envelope generator to modulate the VCA. That's it. That's it. I mean, you could take everything else off of 2600, but if you had two oscillators that you mix into the VCF, two envelope generators in the VCA, you can make incredible analog synthesizer music with just that. And the power of analog synthesis is that this idea of the basic patch is so simple to understand from a mechanical point of view. You know, oscillator, filter, VCA, envelope generator. That's it. From that, you can, you've all heard synthesizer music. You've all probably heard a lot of analog synthesizer music. That's the essence. Everything else is like the windshield wipers on a car. You don't have it, but it's nice, and you can do something with it. But the basic patch is what, you understand that, and you understand how to make good sounds with that, then that's the essence of analog synthesis. It's that simple. And once I learned that, and I read that in an obscure little book that was published, it was actually the ARP 2600 Owner's Manual. They talk about that on page 1. And once you do that and understand that that's the basics, then everything else you add one by one. But the basic patch is what it's all about. You do that and you're making great sounds.
Can we, because I mean this is obviously a chance to go off on about 8 million different tangents. Can we get a quick show of hands for who wants to have like a little one-on-one on like what these elements are and waveforms and that kind of stuff? Interesting? Yes, no, maybe? If not, we do it later. Okay, that's a good half. Can we probably, take it in like a...
Okay. Well, keep in mind that the basics are two oscillators, filter, VCA, two envelope generators. Now you can have three oscillators, you can have more, I mean, you can always expand it, but then when it comes to the wave, you mentioned waveform. Well, waveform is like in an orchestra, the difference between a flute and a violin. Do you want a flute? Do you want a violin? Do you want a clarinet? Or in this case, do you want a sawtooth, square wave, sine wave? And these are now really easy concepts. And you change the waveform, you change the quality, but you haven't changed the basic patch. It's still oscillators into the filter with envelope modulation. It's that's still. So you want a little different quality, you can change the waveform from sawtooth to pulse. If you want a sound that moves in time, you can modulate one of these things. But it's just keeping in mind the basic patch, you can change these little elements one by one.
Can we do it probably in like a graphic or karaoke kind of version? I mean, you got the oscillator, which is the source, the first thing you start with.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, you never want the best way to make a really awful synthesizer sound is to work with one oscillator. You always have two, and you don't really need three, because the three adds very little, but you can't do it with one. So that's the first basic lesson you learn, at least the way I think of it, is getting a really good sound. You can't do it with one, so you have two oscillators. Then to get the overall quality of the sound, the overall writing quality, you do the different things with the filter, and
What does a filter actually do? I mean, let's start something very simple. A sine wave. Ben, can you do a sine wave sound?
Sine wave's not a good example.
There you go. See, we're amateurs. You have to teach us.
The idea behind the filter is to change the overtones that are coming out. So if you want more high end, you open the filter. We say open the filter. If you want more of a mellow sound, you lower the filter. But what's more important is that you can modulate the filter. You can make the filter setting move through time by an envelope generator. And so what this leads to is, of course, the sound you hear, and especially in the early synthesizer days. Another thing you can do with the filter is add what's called resonance, which makes a little peaking sound. And then as you use the envelope to change the filter frequency with this resonance turned up, you get the famous sound, and so that's used probably too much. But you just add these things one by one and you see what they do. And of course it's up to the creativity of the musician using it to how these come together as real music.
A lot of your, especially later machines, were credited with having that fat or warm sound. Are these categories that apply to an engineer in any sense?
Well, this is, of course, something that I had to deal with for all the years I made synthesizers, is why does the Oberheim have a certain sound? Why does the Mini Moog have a certain sound? There's no engineering, I've never heard of a good engineering explanation as to why a Mini Moog sounds better than, let's say, some lesser synthesizer, but it's from an engineering point of view, it's probably too complex to try to analyze, but it has to do with whether it's a Mini Moog filter or an Oberheim filter. There's a little bit of distortion. There's the way that the harmonics are subtracted out as you change the filter frequency. You can't explain them from an engineering point of view because the ear is much more sensitive to sounds in many ways than you can use a piece of test equipment. I mean, it's like in the studio, some people say, oh yeah, I would never use a digital mixer because I want the sound of an analog fader. And I mean, I don't know if people still do that, but probably some people do, because the ear and the brain are so much more sensitive than just engineering instruments.
Well, you just mentioned the Moog, and the late Robert Moog very much argued that there's parts of the ghost of the man who made it still in that machine.
Well, I got to know Bob Moog quite well, although he was an East Coast guy and I was a West Coast guy, so I didn't see him often. But Bob was not a person you forget because he was very warm, very funny guy. He was not a snob at all. He would, you could go out and have a drink or two with him and have a lot of fun. But he was, he had a quality that I like to think that I have a similar quality to, and I've known other engineers that didn't have this quality, is he appreciated, like I do, the result of the engineering work that we did. And I mentioned it before, and that is that this wonderful music that comes out of great musicians using this equipment, or not. So, I mean, I don't mean great by fame, but I mean great by devotion. And of course, it's well known that he was a good friend of Keith Emerson. And when he, remember the story, when he started getting to know Keith Emerson in the Emerson Lake Palmer days, and Keith was using a big Moog that was impossible to use on a tour because it took a roadie full time to keep it going. But still, Moog understood his music and what he was doing, and he appreciated what Keith Emerson and other great users of the, where it's the mini Moog or whatever, so he was able to take the knowledge he had of engineering and his love of music and continually refine the process of making his machine sound great. And I'd like to think that I had some success there as well, because you know, I think I can tell the difference between a fat synthesizer and a not so fat synthesizer. And we won't mention any names, but I think ultimately I shouldn't say that this isn't necessarily a good thing to say, but people are drawn to something that has a musical, even though it's a machine, has a different kind of musical element. Now, that doesn't mean that it's clean, without distortion, by any means. Maybe it's got just the right amount of distortion for one person's taste, or maybe it's got lots of distortion that somebody. It's hard to explain. But in terms of the classic analog synthesizer sound, what Moog was able to do, partially by design, but partially because he understood music and loved music, was that when you have a big analog synthesizer sound and it's kind of one of these, you know, one thing would be you get to the bottom and the thing dies out. Well, maybe that's not the best. You want to hear the walls shake. And he understood that. So
I kind of like it how there's this element of hip hop in there. You know, there's the East Coast, the West Coast. There's a lot of hating on like the really whack competition, and you don't even want to give them props by naming them. And
well,
on the same,
I was thinking not so much East Coast, West Coast hip hop. I was thinking of over the years I've known. You might say the synthesizers I have known and not loved. Now, in the hands of a creative musician, which we presume all of you are, even the worst synthesizer on the planet can become an effective tool. But still, there's just certain things that I love in the way of sound, and you might love something completely different. And to me, what drove me to work 16 hours a day for years and years and loving every minute is to not, it's not when I have the soldering iron in my hand and I get done and I say, ooh, look at this great circuit. It's when I hear this, I hear someone take this sound, and we'll get to this later too, take this sound and it's like, I made that and it makes that music. It's just, you know. So, but still, I think there's different levels of different kinds of synthesizers make different sounds, and I'm more from the classic period, you might say, of the 70s and 80s, and I've learned in many cases, there's stuff that I looked down at in, let's say, the 80s, and now I hear them being used in the newer music, like the stuff that you people make, and it's like, well, I didn't realize that could make that great a sound. So it's education. But I have to admit, my My love of making synthesizers is big, fat sounds. That happens to be what I happen to like. And so, fortunately, there's other people on the planet that like that as well. So it's been fun. So, sorry.
Well, there's a part two to the hip-hop analogy as well, because in the same place as you were really tough competitors in the marketplace, there seems to be an awful lot of respect for certain other key players as well.
Well, when I was starting to do synthesizer, and through, let's say, the late 70s and the early 80s, the main competition was, well, Arp was never really a competitor, because by the time I was building my Oberheim stuff, Arp was pretty much out of business. But still, there was a point in time where I think one of my claims to fame is the first polyphonic synthesizer you could actually buy in a music store. And so I had some fame for a couple of years. Then the Prophet 5 came along and pretty much almost put me out of business. But it pushed me on to other stuff. And in those days, Sequential Circuits was run by a guy named Dave Smith. He could sell everything he could make, and I could sell everything I could make. So it wasn't really, we were technically competitors, but it wasn't ever a problem. Same way with Roger Lynn, who's a good friend. He had the LM1 and then the Lindrum, and I had the DMX, and we could sell pretty much everything we could build. And so, yes, we were competitors, but it wasn't like he was taking my sales away or I was taking his sales. We coexisted. Now, I don't know in the hip-hop world how the coexistence works. I think maybe it's not as friendly.
Well, to close this little hip-hop trilogy off, most of you guys today meet now and then in a thing called the Dead Presidents Society.
Oh, yeah.
Was there some sort of an institution like that back then?
No, I think that didn't exist then, because when Roger and Dave and I and other people we know were in the synthesizer business, it was this frantic race to utilize the latest technology, because the technology was changing so fast. I mean, when I look back on it, I was really only in the synthesizer business 10 years, from 75 to 85. And if you look at the first synthesizer I did in 74, 75, and 10 years later, technologically, they're so different. And so I think that we didn't have time to we would maybe meet at the trade show and have dinner together, but we're all so busy trying to do the next best thing, or make enough profit to keep the company going, or worry about the technology or whatever, that we didn't have time then to meet often for social things. We were running, I think we'd say, and we were running scared. All of us were, the small companies. And of course, this is the period of time when we were all looking over our shoulder to Japan, because it's about around 1980 when Japan started getting in the synthesizer business, and we were worried about that. And so we were always running as fast as we could. We didn't have a lot of time for social things.
Just before the Japanese entered the game here, you and Bob, despite all the respect, had very different views regarding polyphony.
Oh, yeah.
Could you first of all explain what that is, and then?
Well, the original, the synthesizers that were made up to like 1975 were all monophonic, in that you could only play one note. You could put 5 fingers down on a keyboard, but you couldn't get 5 notes. You'd get one note, one sound, one pitch. Oh yeah, well, you could have lots of pitches, but it was still one note. And I had done an experiment with a friend of mine who is a composer and performer of experimental music in Los Angeles in the early 70s, who was a really fantastic improviser, keyboard improviser. And he would give concerts where he would improvise on themes he took from the audience for the first half of the concert. In the second half, we would hook up some ring modulators and Revox tape recorder for tape echo and things like this, and do live electronic music. And during one of those concerts, I brought two 2600s, which of course were a monophonic synthesizer. But I had built a little circuit board that went in the ARP 2600 that allowed you to play two keys and get two pitches, not two voices. The two oscillators could be played at two pitches. They still had to go this one filter, one a VCA. But I took two 2600s to one of these concerts and set it up so he could play some simple 4-part Bach type stuff. And even though it's extremely crude, there was no, we had to very carefully set the synthesizer. To me, it sounded like this is something that I have to pursue, because it just sounded great to hear polyphonic music on a synthesizer, although that was not something that was practical yet. And so this was in the back of my mind, which led a few years later to me doing a true polyphonic synthesizer.
Okay. So polyphony against monophony, just in one sentence, and
it's the ability to play more than one note at a time. If you have a 4-voice polyphonic synthesizer, you can play 4 notes, whereas on a Mini Moog, ARP 2600, etc., you can only play 1 note. That's the difference. And I think if the synthesizer had stayed monophonic, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting a world as it is today, at least not for me.
Nevertheless, could you understand Bob's stance towards it?
Well, he came from the world, the way he came into synthesizers was the idea of how a synthesizer could make very complex sounds, and then you could overdub to add them together, like, of course, the famous Switched on Bach, which really put synthesizers on the map. Bob didn't really concentrate that much in the early days on making instruments for musicians that went on tours or were performing musicians. I mean, of course, as I said earlier, you could do, if you had enough resources, you could take a big modular Moog on the road, but you'd have to have a roadie and all that. But my goal from the beginning of what I was doing, this was with the ring modulator and the phase shifter and on up, was to build equipment for musicians who want to tour with the equipment or carry it from one place to another, and wasn't just locked into their studio. That was could be, as I said in some ads once, take the studio to the stage. And so I think he was always thinking more in terms of, well, you're in the studio, you can overdub like they did like Carlos did on Switched on Bach, and so you don't need polyphony because you can do it by overdubbing. But if someone wants to play polyphonic synthesizer stuff on tour, they can't overdub, obviously.
Yeah, I guess his favorite quote in that context was, if God had meant you to sing polyphonic, he would have given you more than one voice in the first place.
I guess. But he did give us more than one finger.
Well, too late to argue on that one. But the finger gives us the next a very important topic in designing these interfaces is the interface as such. Like, do you use a keyboard or not?
Well, this was, of course, the interesting thing about the invention of the synthesizer was it wasn't a invention exclusively of Bob Moog. At the same time that Bob Moog was inventing the synthesizer in New York, there was another engineer who I also see at my coffee and Thursdays, named Don Buchla. He basically invented the synthesizer as we know it about the same time Bob Moog did, and they didn't really know it. They didn't know each other. They're just independent. But Moog's philosophy was always to make it so that a musician could relate to it from a conventional music point of view. So it had a black and white, regular conventional keyboard. Buchla didn't believe in that, and still doesn't to this day that much. And so he was building synthesizers that you interfaced with various kind of touch keyboards and other non-traditional controller ideas. And so that's the way. Just some people go in one direction, some people go in another direction.
What is the thing that we see on there?
Okay, this is Oberheim 4-voice polyphonic synthesizer. This is what really put me on the map in 1975. And the way that this synthesizer was born was in 1974 I developed a little synthesizer module, and you can see 4 of those modules on this machine. And the idea of this module was, among other things, to fatten up the sound or add to the sound of, let's say, a Mini Moog or Arp 2600 or something like that. It was just a synthesizer that had slightly different sound from Moog or slightly different sound from Arp, and you could parallel them together and get slightly different sound. And originally, this module, this SEM module, was just going to be that module by itself to implement the sound of existing machines. But I remembered this experiment I did with my friends several years before at this concert, where we did kind of a crude polyphonic thing, and then one day I decided I just had to do this. And so in January of 1975, I got the idea to put 4 of these modules together, or 8 of them together, with a simple digital keyboard, and have the first polyphonic synthesizer. And so I designed this. The module was already in existence when I made this decision, and so it took me about 6 weeks to design this machine. And later, of course, these things would take a year to design, but this one I did in 6 weeks because actually it was a matter of survival, because up to this point in time, the company in Chicago had been selling lots of my phase shifters and some ring modulators, and I had some other pedals by then also. And one day in January of '75, they called up and said, "Oh, Tom, times are bad, our business isn't good, we're canceling all our orders with you." And so all of a sudden, I had no real business. And that's when I said, well, maybe the time has come to do this polyphonic idea. And I took the module I already had and put 4 of them together with a keyboard, and a few months later showed it at the NAMM show, and the Oberheim synthesizer world was born. And it was kind of in a way out of desperation. But sometimes we need to be pushed along in what we're going to do. You know, it's like you have to get it done by tomorrow. You better get it done. And so we do things that we would normally not do if we had lots of time to do them.
I guess this is the time where we should probably listen to something as well. Oops. So this is a little medley that you put together of things. Now the interesting thing is, obviously at this time, oops, I'm giving it all away, damn it. At this time, people... Oh, we got a smart one in the house, hooray. Not just a pretty face, as they say. Obviously at that time, like, my parents wouldn't be able to get any of those machines, and I guess neither did any of ours. I mean, how many units did you sell of this?
Of the polyphonic stuff? Oh, not that many in those days. It was
What was the going rate for it?
$4,000 or $5,000. But what else? You know, TR-808s weren't sitting in used music stores or whatever for $300. You were in it or you weren't in it. And the first track I played of my medley was Pat Metheny Group, which is a very popular jazz group. And they've been in existence for, I think, almost 30 years, and very, very popular. And I saw Pat Metheny a year or so ago at a concert he gave, fantastic concert. And after all the people who wanted to say hello to him had left, I waited around and we talked, and he said, you know, Tom, when I started my group, I had to have an Oberheim, and so I took the last money from my paper route to help pay for my Oberheim. So I think, I've also, I think I was telling Thorson, I knew Tangerine Dream in the early days because they bought an Oberheim in the very early days of Oberheim, you know, Polyphonic, I think in '76, and I visited them in Berlin many times. And in the early days, they would do a concert, and they'd take every Pfennig or whatever it was, and they'd put it into gear. And so, yes, they were expensive, but what else was it? If you had to have it, you had to have it. And so people found ways, and I'm sure you find ways too if you have to have something or something you must do. So, of course, it's a different mix then. I was, like I said, mainly oriented toward the performing musician, the people that would play in clubs and go on tour. So, but most of them in the early days, a lot of them weren't rich. So it was expensive, but it's all there was.
When did you ever find out about like that second generation of people using this stuff that were, you know, the second-hand market and reviving like your original gear?
Well, in a very general, simple sense, the synthesizer world kind of went from analog through 70s and the early 80s, and then became digitalized with the DX7 and other digital machines, mainly from Japan. And this kind of killed analog. Analog was basically, I think there was one time when no companies were making analog synthesizers. Then computers got more powerful, and now, you know, it went from plugins. But it's like these different threads are going along, and one will come and one will go, and then there will be another one. I mean, I remember, I assume most of you have seen maybe a DX7 or know what it is. It was the first digital synthesizer. It was real popular, and it came on the scene and exploded, and 5 years later was dead. And analog did the same thing. It became very popular in late 70s, early 80s, then it died out. And these things come and they go, another thing gets big and it dies, and just it's a continual process. So there was a time when you could buy an Oberheim. It was before eBay, but you could buy an Oberheim for nothing. You get a 4-voice for $200. So now, of course, it's a little different. So I think it's cycles. You know, probably in another 5 years, nobody wants it again. Who knows? It's just continually cycles.
Well, and even in these cycles, I mean, it really depends on where you are. I mean, $50 might mean a terribly different thing depending on where you are, or those $100. And yeah, here's a little example by some boys that used the Oberheim that was used in a local church, because it had this really fat organ sound again, and did something slightly different with it. this is not necessarily what you designed the machines for in the first place.
Oh, that's absolutely not true. You may, well, how to say that? This is the first time I've heard this track when I came here today, and it wouldn't necessarily be the kind of music I listen to all day long, but I love it. It's great, and I can, at first, I suppose if I heard it in a different context, I don't go around saying, ooh, is there an Oberheim on that? I listen to the music to listen to the music. So the fact it's got an Oberheim on it, that's great, but I make the instrument, the instruments I made knowing that, like I said earlier, the process isn't done. So, you know, whether it's Pat Metheny, it's very kind of soft jazz and almost symphonic in a way, or something like this, which is in a different genre completely. I have the same feeling. Now, I won't say that everything I hear I like, but it's the same way in every music, you know. So, but I don't agree. No, I think that the same emotion is there. I built this thing, and you give it to a musician, and they do what they want to do with it. And not everybody's going to do soft jazz, thank goodness.
Well, in a pretty direct way, these guys were kind of very heavily influenced by another artist that you had a stronger relationship with. And that is not the hum.
Which one was that? I don't think that was an Oberheim, thank goodness. Okay, let me talk about this because this is not Oberheim, as a matter of fact. Although there's an Oberheim story here. This is actually a big, monstrous 250-pound Yamaha machine called a CX-80, I think, that Stevie Wonder, this is Stevie Wonder, Songs in the Key of Life. And at the time he was making this album, I had a friend in America who was a producer and wrote a column for a magazine called Mix. Have you ever read Mix magazine, any of you? No? Okay. It's a recording studio magazine, and my friend wrote for that. But he knew Stevie Wonder very well, and in the early days of developing the Oberheim, he took me to the studio in Hollywood where Stevie Wonder was doing Songs in the Key of Life, and I met Stevie. And it was just coincidentally, just a month or two later, I had the first prototype of the Oberheim. And I took it to the studio, and Stevie loved it. Now, what you hear here is this CX-80, but later he used, he bought it. It was the prototype, and he bought it. It was like, wow, my first sale is Stevie Wonder, which never hurts to, you know, to have something like that. I don't know specifically what songs on the Key of Life. I'm not sure he used the Oberheim on that, but that thank Thorsten for playing it because it is connected, but that was not, that was the CX-80. You wouldn't want to carry the CX-80 to your studio or something else since it weighed about, I don't know, what, 300 pounds or some crazy machine. There are only 2 or 3 ever made, I think. But thank you. Yeah, 2, I think. 2? He'd had 2? Well, there weren't very, well, there are other people that had, I mean, they made, maybe they made 10 or 20, I think. I forget who had one. But it was a monster. And what was interesting for me was that ultimately, I think the people in the studio, I don't know if Stevie ever said this to me, but one of the engineers told me later, he says, you know, after Stevie learned the Oberheim, he says he got much better sounds from that than from the Yamaha. Now, the Yamaha had more capability, but it's not the sound I like, so it was encouraging.
I think the first time I read Oberheim was actually on the back of a Stevie record, or I saw one, was the back of a very popular record with my mother that I didn't like so much on the first side, but then I turned it around and I saw, oh, there's a different song on the flip side, and next to the song was this picture of Stevie sitting in his castle of keyboards, and in the middle of it, there was an Oberheim, and he had like everything that was written on it in Braille.
Oh yeah, sure. He also was very good on playing the 2600 because the paint on the 2600 panel he learned. So in other words, there were little marks where, you know, this 2600 was all fader type things, and he would feel the marks, and he programmed that himself. I mean, he couldn't see it, but of course, in the end, it's not how it looks, it's how it sounds.
He had two guys working with him that also did other crazy electronic stuff. I always tend to mix up their names. Lars, bitte.
Who's that? I still can't hear.
Toto's expanding headband.
Oh yeah, yeah. There was a couple guys in Los Angeles that made this monstrous analog synthesizer. What was his name? Crazy guy. And now I won't be able. It was Bob Margolif, who was a producer on early Stevie Wonder, and this other guy. Yeah, they had many different kinds of synthesizer. This thing they called Tonto expanding headband was Arps and a little Oberheim and some Moogs and in a big monstrous thing. It was. I don't think they took that to Stevie's studio. That one didn't move.
Now, when you were starting out, like from what you told earlier, it sounds a little bit like you were some sort of a circuitry chef. Like you were there in the kitchen and you were handing it out to other people to, you know, enjoy the feast. Like, what role did these people play in the middle of that?
Well, first let me say that I'm at that time and even today, I'm not the circuit design expert that Bob Moog was. He was a genius with circuitry, and although most people look at his fame as having invented the synthesizer and what he did there, from an engineer's point of view, it's some of the circuitry he did that I admire, because like I said earlier, he had worked with another engineer, this guy Bodo, who came up with the original idea of having patch cords and stuff. So, but Moog did the filter that the Moog filter that we all love, and you know, people talk about mini Moog filter, but it started with the big Moog modular. That was Bob's invention down to the transistor level, each transistor, and he was a genius there. When I did Oberheim, I didn't consider myself a great circuit guy, and so I had help, and I went to, in one case, part of the Oberheim module was designed by an engineer at Arp, and another one was designed by engineer at EMU, a guy that started EMU, who they originally started out as a little company building modular synths before they invented the sampler, or helped invent the sampler. So I had help there. I spent time with the idea of putting the system, putting the modules together and making it so it was at least partially playable by a human being. If not, it wasn't always easy.
There's an awful lot of things that we even haven't gone near yet, but one thing we definitely can't miss out on is, I mean, we've talked about synths as such, and probably there isn't that much of a difference in the first place.
Yeah.
But a lot of people know you for this little thing as well. What you should see here is a Dmx Drum Machine. So can you probably tell us what you learned from doing the synthesizer and how you implemented that in building the drum machine?
Well, there's a few stories, I guess, about the DMX. In probably in 1979, by then I had been in the polyphonic synthesizer business 3+ years, and somebody mentioned to me that this guy named Roger Lynn had invented a thing called a programmable drum machine, and I wondered, well, what is that? I mean, I'd heard about, you know, if you you probably don't remember, or maybe had never exposed to this, but in the early days of the Hammond organ, they made little boxes that would play electronic tango and crap, just horrible stuff. You know, nothing you'd ever want to listen to very long. But when I heard about this thing called the Programmable Drum Machine by this guy Roger Lynn, who I hadn't met, I thought, well, it's programmable, which is so you can make your own rhythms, and it's real drum sound. I thought this is a genius of an idea. So it turned out Roger was in Los Angeles, and then on those days I was in Los Angeles, and so I invited Roger over to my company, and by then I had 20 people, 25 people, so I was really in business, and Roger was just himself. He was a rock and roll guitar player that had this idea, and so we talked for a while, and I said, why don't we do this together, and we'll make it and sell it and, you know, pay you royalty or whatever. He says, no, I want to start my own company. I want to do this on my own. So Roger went off and started his company, Lynn Electronics, and did his first product was the LM1, and then later he did the Lynn Drum. And we thought, well, you know, this absolutely connects to synthesizers. It's not a synthesizer, but they just go together. And so we came up with our own drum machine, which is called the Dmx. And it was another situation where Roger could sell all he could make, and we could sell all we could make. So we were technically competitors, but not fighting it out. And some people liked the sound of the LM1 and the Lynn Drum and the particular sounds he had and the particular user interface he had, and some people liked what we had. But that led to another thing I'll just mention very briefly. Before long, we realized, well, we've got this synthesizer that's controlled. By then, we were doing the OBX, OBXA, which were computer-controlled, programmable. You know, you could store patches in memory, and so they were controllable by a computer. So we designed a computer interface for, I think the first one was the OBXA, and also I hired a young kid who hadn't even finished high school and gave him the job of designing our first polyphonic sequencer we call the DSX, and then we figured out a way to hook all these together. Now this is before MIDI. MIDI hadn't been invented yet. So we had this, what we called the Oberheim System, where he had a synthesizer that was driven by the sequence to this DSX sequencer, and then it sent a clock to the DMX that synchronized the drums to the sequencer. And so that was popular for a year or two until MIDI was invented. And
I mean, MIDI as such wasn't really, I mean, first of all, what is MIDI? And I do understand it wasn't a sole invention as such either. There were a lot of different people involved in it as well. Well,
there weren't that many people involved. The idea for MIDI started with Dave Smith, who was the founder of Sequential Circuits, who had the Prophet 5, and now is back in business with the Prophet 08, doing very well. And he had the idea for that's what we call MIDI, which is a way of hooking synthesizers together using digital signals. And he first presented a first idea of that by himself at a technical conference. And then later he expanded and started working with Roland. And really, MIDI wasn't that many people. It was basically this guy Dave Smith at Sequential, and Roland did most of the work. And of course now MIDI is everywhere. But it was really just the work of a couple engineers at Roland and this guy Dave Smith and one of his engineers. And now it's everywhere. And at first we wondered if it would work that well, but over years the software engineers have found ways to make it so it works pretty well. It's used a lot. And Dave's another one of my good friends who I see. He doesn't live in San Francisco where we have our coffee on Thursdays, but he lives maybe 2 hours away, and so I see him once in a while. And we don't talk about the old days, we talk about what's happening now. People think we have this coffee thing with all these electronic music people, and we don't talk about electronic music. We talk about, can you get OS X to work? No. On this software program? Oh, no. How do you get, oh, well, let's call our friend at Apple and see if he can, and that's what we talk about at coffee. And we don't talk about synthesizers.
Was it for you any difference designing circuitry patches and whatnot to create drum sounds?
Well, I didn't.
Or that were just specifically, or let me rephrase this. What did you have to tackle differently in selling a machine that only contained a handful of sounds than a machine that rather gives you almost infinite possibilities?
Up to the time that the DMX and the Lindrum came on the market, there had been some drum synthesizers by a couple companies in England. I think there was one in the US, and they just weren't successful. And so I think what, at that time, which we're talking about 1979, 1980, whereas synthesizers can be programmed to sound very differently just by changing a few things, people wanted real drum sounds. They wanted real drum sounds because, like I said, I catered to making equipment for traveling musicians, and I won't go into the philosophy of telling your drummer to go to hell, but all that did happen to some extent. For whatever reason, people wanted real drum sounds. They weren't that interested in synthesized drums because it's a lot harder to synthesize a really powerful drum sound, although it's doable, as the TR-8 proves, because of course there's some sounds in the TR-808 that are not recorded, but it takes a lot of work to make it really sound good, and so it was easier just to do recordings that you could play back. And by then the Fairlight was an entity, so we understood that the Fairlight and sampling was just beginning, so it wasn't a big thing yet, so we knew we could do it. But I think basically the market wanted real drum sounds, not synthesized. The mindset was a little different. I mean, I think when you listen, for instance, we listened to the track from the Detroit guys. I mean, the drum makes it happen, and I just never heard. And we're talking now 1980, not 2009 or 2008. I just don't think that there was the drum synthesizer stuff available then had the power that people wanted, and so it never became popular. So the recorded sounds were what people wanted, at least that I perceived that at the time.
I mean, from today's nerd perspective, it's an absolutely fantastic thing that you need a little EEPROMer and burn your own little chip to change the sound. But I imagine if at the time I had to build such a thing, I would be so devastated.
Well, there were people making different drum chips at the time. We eventually made a product, Oberheim, where you could burn your own drum chips. It was called the Promer. It wasn't very successful, but there were companies that sprung up in garages and did this kind of work, and so there were little companies you could buy drum chips from. In fact, that's exactly how Digidesign started. There was two guys in a garage building drum chips for Lindrums and Oberheim Drum Machines. Then they got the idea to do hard disk recording, and of course now Digidesign's monstrous.
They've done quite all right.
Yeah, they've done okay.
You should have ever thought you should have chipped in there and like gave them a $250 grant or something?
Well, we never thought when they got out of the drum chip business and got into recording on hard disk, that was a big step, and that they were the first to do that successfully.
Probably, I mean, there's a lot of beat heads in here. I probably just quickly run through a couple of those Oberheim drum sounds, which loads of you will recognize from anywhere from Lionel Richie till Run DMC and back. Hang on. Oh, that one. Are we playing a round of Spot the Drum now? And anyone yells out names of things. But obviously these are all like really sad sampled renditions of it, and it's a totally different feel than having, again, the actual instrument in your hand.
Now, hearing what you're playing, it seems to me that they're a little cleaner than a DMX.
Just a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. Because it was in the early days of recording samples. All of the circuitry necessary to do sampling to do high quality sampling was expensive. It was before the days of CDs, and digital recording wasn't very popular yet, and so we had to make do with a fairly crude recording, but the DMX was our most popular and most successful product, so obviously the people liked what they heard, and I guess some still use it. It's only been 8-9 months ago I took my DMX out of the attic and put it in the trash because I thought I'd never need it again. Should have brought it. We could have had a raffle.
Well, we could have had a pretty nice auction in here, I guess, yeah. But, I mean, you did other companies later, but one crucial point that I want to touch upon before we open it to the floor is at some stage you walked down the street or into a shop and you saw an Oberheim product which wasn't yours anymore because you lost the name. Mm. Is that like losing a child, or?
Well, it's a slightly different emotion. Actually, let me just say that I'd never actually walked into a music store and seen an Oberheim that wasn't mine. But I think you're talking in more in a metaphor than anything. You might ask, well, why did you stop in 1985? Well, this is very much an American story, and I'll make it very brief. Essentially what happened is, when I started the company in 1970, I hired a lawyer to do the basic company stuff, which is I decided I wanted to make it a corporation, and so this lawyer did the stuff that you do to make a corporation, the paperwork. And over the years, I went to him for advice. As Oberheim got bigger, I'd go to him occasionally for advice. But in 1985, Oberheim got in trouble financially, because we were developing the Matrix 12, which is the biggest and most expensive machine we'd done, and basically we weren't careful with the finance, and we pretty much ran out of money. And so I went to this lawyer who I'd known for 15 years and trusted, and he gave me advice that over the first few months of 1985 led to pushing the company to the edge of bankruptcy. It wasn't that Oberheim wasn't making a profit, but we were taking the profit and we were using it to buy parts for the Matrix 12, and we just ran out of money. And it was, of course, a big mistake. I should have been more conservative, because the Matrix 12, I don't know if you've ever seen one, it's a big machine. It's 12 voice, polyphonic, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, my lawyer convinced me that he had a plan that even though Oberheim wasn't going to be able to continue in the way it had been, that he had a plan that he told me if I didn't follow his plan, that the bank that Oberheim owed money to would probably not only shut down Oberheim, but also take my house. And I didn't, the thought of that wasn't very happy to me nor my wife. And so I went with his advice, and it was a complicated legal thing involving lawyers, stuff I didn't understand. And to make a long story short, he ended up buying the assets of the company from the Oberheim Bank with the plan that he and I had talked about, that we'd be 50-50 partners in this new company that owned the assets for Oberheim, but that the 50-50 never happened. So after working for him for about 1.5 years and realizing, and also talking to other people, and said, I had at the time, Oberheim did a little work in patents, and I had a patent attorney that got me helped me get some patents. And I went to lunch with him one day, and he said, I told him what happened. He says, well, he screwed you. It's like, what? I thought he was such a great guy, he screwed you. He should never have done that. And by then of course it was history. And so that was the end of Oberheim for me. And then what he did is he drained all of the readily available money out of what was left of Oberheim. And he then gave to Gibson for future royalties the Oberheim name and the Oberheim logo. So that's why Gibson now owns the Oberheim name. So that's the sad story of the end of Oberheim. So I had nothing to do with the OB12 or there's several things made by Gibson and also made by Viscount. I had nothing to do with any of those. So as far as I'm concerned, those are not Oberheim products.
I mean, you went on and founded Marion and C Sound, and right. But what's probably a lot more interesting to the people here is, that's like the ultimate scenario of like mistrust and everything that you always fear about, like, ooh, sneaky lawyers. And as you called it an American story, and in a way it is, because it's like, in Europe, everyone is just incredibly afraid of ever going bankrupt ever, and they think like they need to immediately commit like harakiri-style suicide. And whereas over there, it seems like this
happens a lot.
Yeah. And how did you find the strength to brush yourself up and try again?
Well, it's the love of doing it. I think I've made the point now that I didn't do this to get rich. I did this because it's thrilling to make instruments that, whether it's these guys in Detroit or Eddie Van Halen or whoever, I never met Eddie Van Halen, but I don't have to meet him. I hear, the thrill of seeing this particular song or whatever, and I just had to do it. So I had to start over. And so I started a new company and did a synthesizer and did it too fast and didn't do it right, and it wasn't a success. And so then I kind of took a retirement from the synthesizer business. Also, to me, the business has become so uninteresting, because the business had become workstations from Japan, and I have no interest in this at all. But when I started hearing about little bits and pieces about this new, what I consider new, when we look at my career of being in engineering for 50 years and being in electronic music for 30-some years, that to me the DJ producer thing is what I call new. hearing what people are doing and starting hearing some interesting music. First, of course, I heard some of this music before I knew what the name was. Because it's easy to say jazz. Everybody knows what jazz is. Or it's easy to say rock and roll or heavy metal or whatever, but it's harder to say what you people do because, I mean, there's so many little names for stuff, and of course I don't know enough about this music to know the difference between bass and drums and the next one. But still, I discovered that I've heard a lot of this music, and of course a lot of it's synthesized. I love synthesized music. Yesterday when Joel played that piece from that LP from, I guess, an Italian group from the set, it's just fantastic to hear that. Now, there was no Oberheim on that at all, because that was, I think he said that was done before Oberheim even had a synthesizer. There's no Oberheim on that, but I just love synthesized music in many different ways. So I had to start over. The problem was I did it too fast because I was going to prove to the world that I could do it, and I just didn't do a good job, and so the machine wasn't a success. But now, you know, I'm here thanks to Red Bull, and it's really inspiring to see a different way that synthesized music has gone, and I may do it again. Who knows? Well, thank you. So that's a good place to end, huh? Good place to end it. I mean, thank you very much.
Wow. I'm pretty sure there's an awful lot of questions here, but not really sure how to deal with interim standing ovation here.
I'm not sure he was done, but that's fine.
I mean, I really have the feeling like there is a lot of questions here, but you are here for quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
Some more.
I hope that you don't consider me this God and you're afraid to come ask me anything. I hope I made the point that I love doing this, and whether it's at home in the lab designing some circuit or talking to musicians about what they do, I love it all. So feel free to ask me whatever you want.
Hi, thanks again for being here and sharing your knowledge. I had a little question about the first polyphonic synthesizer.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering why you decided to put 4 modules together and not 3 or 5 or 6, because I don't have them.
The reason I did that is, first of all, when I decided to do it, I had the concept of making it expandable, because it was very expensive, and so you could start with a 4-voice, and later you could expand it to 6 voices and 8 voices. Now, 3 versus 5, well, we were always very curious when the Prophet 5s came out. Why 5 voices? That's a strange, you know, maybe it's 5 fingers, I don't know. But in my case, the circuitry at several levels worked in pairs, and so another machine I did at the same time as a 4-voice, I did one called a 2-voice that had 2 of those modules. But basically, it was an engineering decision on a couple levels, that things worked in pairs, and also I wanted to make an expandable so that a person could buy 4 and then later expand.
Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering, do you play the keyboard?
No, I'm not an instrumental performer.
Did you ever? No, not a performer. Just just in your house, or while you're working on the workshop, and while you were working on something, did it ever tempt you to play a little bit with all these products you were making?
No, and the reason is that the way the process started is I started working with this stuff and started immediately meeting these great musicians, and then it's like, well, I can't play like Herbie, why bother? And so I think it's like there's so much to learn to be a keyboard player, a composer, a band leader that, you know, I can't do it all, so I'm happy to be an engineer and hear what other people do. So, no, I never really played I mean, I always was doing this and trying this and changing the circuitry, did it sound right, and I did that, but not playing music.
We have a couple boring announcements to make right after this, but absolutely not before we say a big thank you for sharing with us and changing the odd brainwave now and then. And here's to Mr. Tom Oberheim, please.